welcome to the Book Faire, Children's Literature for Grown-Ups. I'm Anthony. This week for the podcast, I have a very exciting interview. Author of the Dragon Masters series, which is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year with the release of the Epic Guide to Dragon Masters. Tracey West will be joining us, but first I'd just like to say that if you support the work that we do here at the Book Faire podcast, you can support us in a number of ways, including simply sharing the podcast among friends, family, and educators, or any young readers in your life. You can also rate and review the podcast wherever podcasts are found, be it Spotify or iTunes. And lastly, you can support the podcast either through the links in the description, either through Patreon, support through Spotify, or now you can try out Riverside, and if you make a purchase through Riverside FM to record podcasts, I will receive a commission for those. So if you'd like to support the podcast, there are the easiest and best ways to do so. You can also follow the podcast on Threads, Instagram, and on Facebook. Just look for Book Faire Pod. Now let's move on to the interview with Miss Tracey West. Hello, Tracey West. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Anthony. Thank you for having me on.
Very good. And to start off, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself so that the audience can get a feel for who you are?
Sure. So I am a children's book author. I've been writing children's books for more than 30 years now. And I live in the mountains of New York State with a bunch of chickens and dogs and my husband.
Oh, that sounds like the dream. And we are celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Dragon Masters, as well as the release of the Epic Guide to Dragon Masters. Can you talk a little bit about what is Dragon Masters and what does it mean to be a Dragon Master?
Absolutely. So Dragon Masters is a chapter book series for kids who are just transitioning into chapter books. They're called emergent readers, and it is a fantasy series. And in Dragon Masters, if you are 8 years old, you can be chosen by a magical stone called the Dragon Stone to connect with a dragon. And when you do that, you work with your dragon to learn all about its powers and its hidden powers. And then the Dragon Masters team up and they go on adventures and they save their kingdom and they battle evil wizards and they solve problems and puzzles together.
And with 10 years of Dragon Masters and 24 books released, is there a particular dragon or a particular human character that you have a fondness for?
Oh, so the dragon who appears on the very first book cover is named Worm. And Worm is, every dragon in Dragon Masters has a type. So Worm is an earth dragon. And he's based on research I did about a dragon from Europe called a Wyrm. So Worm isn't exactly a Wyrm, but they have some similarities. They have snake-like bodies, and they don't fly, and they live underground. And then I got to sort of use my imagination to think about what kind of dragon Worm could be. And it turns out Worm is an extremely powerful dragon who's just very kind at the same time and a very gentle dragon, and I like that combination.
Okay, so an affinity for the earth dragons for sure then.
Yes, although I often say if I were a dragon master, I would probably want to have some kind of flower dragon or plant growing dragon because I love to garden. And if I were a dragon, I might be like a tree dragon who lives in the forest with all the forest creatures.
And you did mention the research for the specific type of dragon that Worm is, the Wyrm. The illustrations throughout the series feature dragons from all sorts of mythologies around the world. Is that something that is part of the collaborative process with illustrations, or is that something that you specifically set out to do when writing these characters?
So when I create the dragons, often, yes, some of the dragons are based on dragons that you might find in myths and legends from different parts of the world. And then it's up to me and sometimes experts to do research on what those dragons might look like, and we give that information to the illustrators. Now, Graham Howells, there's been a few illustrators who go back and forth on the series. Graham Howells is one of our main illustrators. He created the whole look for the series, and he is from Wales. And dragon lore is very prevalent there. There's a dragon on the Welsh flag, and so Graham is brought a lot of his knowledge about dragons whenever he would come up with the illustration. So sometimes I'll say, this is what the dragon should look like, and the illustrators come back and say, can we do this instead? So it is very collaborative.
That's very interesting. And you said there's research done from experts. What kind of experts are there on dragons when it comes to creating these characters?
So mostly we would, and Scholastic helps me find experts who might be an expert in the particular tales, customs, etc. of a particular culture. So, for example, Dragon Masters, just to be clear, it takes place in a fantasy version of Earth in around the Middle Ages, around the year 1200, but it has to kind of look like Earth, right? It has to be familiar. And so when the characters go around the world, these experts will be people who are proficient in that time period. And so when we were creating a dragon based in an area of India, it was talking about like what an Indian dragon might look like. And then both Graham and our expert knew that a lot of mythological creatures in India are composites of different, more than one animal or more than one creature. So our dragon has like a beautiful elephant's trunk and tusk. And again, that was another collaboration between somebody well-versed in Indian culture and what Graham knew.
So when we're creating a dragon that is based on the region of India and South Asia, how much of that is taking from mythology and how much of that is pulling from culture to create a more of an original design?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I will say most of the dragons, many of the dragons are just based on what would be a cool power for a dragon to have, and they come specifically from my imagination. So that I know if I'm going to set the book in a fantastic medieval version of India or Korea or someplace, that I might be creating something from scratch or might be adding from something that exists, but whatever I want to do with appreciation and with respect. And so that's where the experts come in.
Okay, so you're more so taking these concepts and you're building the characters from the outside in, looking at the world around them and the mythology of the region.
I think that's fair. That's fair to say. Sure.
And so you mentioned that Scholastic is a resource as far as connecting you with these experts. How has your experience been working with a large publisher like Scholastic in finding these connections?
Well, the person who coordinates all of that is my editor, Katie Corella, and she is a very hands-on and amazing editor. And so again, it's there is a huge team of people behind every book that I write. And, Scholastic is really wonderful in providing me with resources that I need when I request them.
It must be such a load off of your back to be able to have these resources, the editor, the publisher, to just be able to focus on writing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a big part of the process. And so it's nice to have that team.
So you grew up reading books and watching cartoons. If we were to ask a younger Tracey, what would your book and cartoon recommendation be for any given summer, I'd say?
Okay, so let's see. So right off the top of my head, I would say Underdog was a superhero dog, and I was totally obsessed with Underdog and wanted to be Underdog at one point. I was one of those 70s kids who would watch cartoons every Saturday morning religiously, and so and a lot of the live action stuff too, Land of the Lost and all that, all the great Sid and Marty Krofft. As far as books go, that's such a tough question because there were so many books that meant a lot to me in my childhood. I'm very fond of Harriet the Spy, about a 10-year-old girl who wants to be an author. And that's probably because when I was a 10-year-old girl, I also wanted to be an author. So yeah, there's just so much I could recommend, but those are the ones that stand out.
So particularly with Harriet the Spy and seeing yourself as the main character, is that something that you look for in Dragon Masters? Because there is representation of children from all across the world in different cultures.
That was very important to me we began. I was writing 4 books, and I knew there would be a different character featured in each of the books. And we live in a beautifully diverse world, and it's so important for readers to be able to see themselves in books, especially in popular culture, which I think is what Dragon Masters has become. And then as the series expanded, it allowed me to add all kinds of different characters, characters with different abilities. And again, it's so important, not just for kids to see themselves in books, but for kids to read about kids with experiences different than their own. And it's how we become better human beings, I think.
Yes, I say it all the time that every time I read a book, I learn more about myself. And so with representation and letting children see themselves, let's look at more in the community. You run a mobile bookshop called the Dragon Wagon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, I do. So Dragon Wagon is a bit of a paying it forward project. It's a social impact business that my husband and I run. We live in a rural county here in New York State, and I had a conversation with one of the local librarians a few years ago who was saying, like, the library can only have so many books, and a lot of her kids she knows never get to a bookstore. A bookstore might be an hour or an hour and a half away from where that library was. And, she was kind of pushing me to open a bookstore in Margaretville, but running a bookstore is hard work. I spend most of my time writing, but we happen to have this old 1979 small Dodge school bus gifted to us that from a dear friend, and it was just one of those things like, hey, let's turn it into a bookmobile. But then I had to think, well, what kids need is access to books, right? They need more access and they need more choice. And that's what we can do by bringing a small mobile mini bookstore to them. But if they don't have funds, then they don't have that access. So our mission is that every kid who visits the bus gets one free book to keep. And that's no questions asked. It's not buy one, get one. And we've been doing it for 2 years now. We do things like we go to agricultural festivals, we go to the library summer reading kickoffs, and the response we get, like I hear, sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, kids don't read books anymore, or kids aren't excited about books. That is not what we see. We see wide-eyed kids who come up to our bookshelves in our tent, and they're like, really? I get to keep a book for free? Are you serious? Like, it means so much. They get so excited. We see kids jumping up and down when they find the new Dogman book or whatever book it is that they've been wanting. And it's just the most fun thing to do. It's a great project, and we love doing it.
Yes, I love that so much. And we always love to talk about how important libraries are, but even in rural, that's a hard word to say, I'm sorry. Even in rural areas, access to libraries can be difficult, and something like the Dragon Wagon can really help with bringing access to books to children and encouraging them to read. So when it comes to encouraging children to read and writing these books for emergent readers, how have you approached the process of writing these books that are targeted to such young audiences?
Okay, yeah, great question. So I may have mentioned before that Dragon Masters is part of a line of books that Scholastic puts out called Scholastic Branches. And Scholastic Branches books are books for these emergent readers who are transitioning from books with lots of art, very little text, into traditionally chapter books with no art and lots of text. And for many kids, that was like a point where they would stop and they would lose their love of reading because chapter books could be so intimidating. And so the whole Branches line is about easing into kids into the idea that they can read a book with 15 or 16 chapters because we have art. So for Dragon Masters specifically, we have black and white art, but there is artwork on every page. The chapters are all fairly short. Dragon Masters in particular is very action-packed. It's a fast-moving read. I work hard to try to put a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. And those are all things that, you might not find in a novel, but in a series like this, which is designed to get kids feeling comfortable as readers and be excited about what they're reading. It's a strategy that works really well.
Yes, and so targeting young audiences is how I usually try to word it. I try not to use the phrase children's books or kids' books. I always like to talk about media that targets young audiences because you always reach a larger audience than your intended demographic. So meeting them at their level and encouraging them to branch out, as is the name of Scholastic Branches. Do you have any recommendations for books for young readers who may have found a passion for Dragon Masters, but are maybe ready to take that step up and expand their horizons?
There's a really cool series called Dragons in a Bag by Zeta Elliott. And that is slightly above the Dragon Masters level. A lot of Dragon Masters will go on to read Wings of Fire by Twee Sutherland, but it's not necessarily a direct jump. It's a few steps above. So I like to recommend Dragons in a Bag. There's a Scholastic Branches series called, now I can't remember it. Anyway, there's another Scholastic Branches series. There's a series that Scholastic puts out called Dragon Girls, which is very popular. And those are I'm drawing a blank on some of the other ones. But if you're specifically a dragon fan, I do like Dragons in a Bag.
As we're talking about this process of, stepping up and reading, you started with Harriet the Spy. How had your reading journey progressed from there as you grew older?
Oh, so that's a great question. So basically I grew up in a small town with a small library, and my summer routine would be walk a couple miles. No, it was a mile. Walk a mile to the library, get 5 books, go home, read them, and go back to the library the next day. And so I pretty much went through, I would read anything the librarian would recommend to me, which was most things. And then when I got a little bit older, she would gravitate me toward the mystery section and the adult section. And I became a mystery reader from that. And then I was an English and a journalism major in college, and I read all kinds of literature in college, but nothing spoke to me. I'll just be honest, nothing spoke to me the way kids' books spoke to me. They let me escape, they let me dream, they let me build my imagination. It wasn't until I was maybe into my 30s that I just started discovering fantasy authors that I really liked. I don't know why it took me so long to discover adult fantasy authors, but that always seemed kind of violent and unapproachable. But then I discovered, Terry Pratchett and some other people.
Got it right here.
Yeah.
I found this at Dollar General.
Did you really?
That's weird. Yeah, it's a strange place to find a Terry Pratchett book. My grandpa loved Terry Pratchett, and so I've always had some of them laying around. But I have such a hard time reading fantasy. I've never finished The Hobbit. I've never finished. I've finished a Terry Pratchett book, So you mentioned an English major and going into journalism. When along the journey did you start writing?
Oh, so I was writing stories for myself, throughout elementary school, high school, college. My strategy was because I um, grew up near New York City, which is obviously the publishing capital of certainly the United States. Um, I kept thinking in the back of my mind, how do I become a children's book writer? So I went and worked in children's publishing from the editorial end, and kind of all right. So I worked for, I don't know if you know what a book packager is. A book packager is basically a small company that puts books together from, hiring the author to getting the art done and then turns everything over to a publisher to publish. And the book packager I worked for was doing all the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys books for a publisher. And they had a real system going where you would first come up with a story idea, and then they would hire somebody to write an outline for the story, and then they sometimes somebody in-house would do it, and then they would turn it over to an author to write. And so I figured out, oh, maybe this is a way to learn. And so I started by first coming up with story ideas that got turned into books. And then I progressed, and they let me write some outlines. And then, so one of the very first books I wrote, I think, was a Nancy Drew Hardy Boys crossover called Spies and Lies, about going undercover in the FBI Academy. But it was, it was good training. It was good experience. And through working in publishing, I started to meet editors, and then I could say, hey, I have an idea for this or that. And, you had your foot in the door that way. And that's kind of where it all began.
And so you started off with, of course, writing books targeting young audiences, and now you're moved on to you moved on to Pixie Tricks and Cupcake Diaries, and now Dragon Masters. Do you have any particular writing goals for things that you maybe see yourself doing? What maybe after Dragon Masters has reached an ending point?
I do have some ideas. As someone who grew up reading mysteries, I've never really had a mystery series out. I think about that, and I also am in love with for slightly older kids, it's the cozy fantasy genre. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's sort of it's sort of like, what happens when the battle is over and you maybe open a coffee shop, which is the plot of Legends and Lattes by
I have a book in my work backpack called You Can't Spell Treason Without Tea.
Oh.
And I bought that entirely based on the title.
Oh my good. Wait, did I just buy that book? Is that, that's not the Sarah Beth Durst book, is it? She has anyway, have to look.
Rebecca Thorne is the author.
I have one with also something about tea in the title from a really wonderful fantasy writer for young people, Sarah Beth Durst. And so, right. So, to be quite honest, though, Dragon Masters takes up a lot of my time and creative energy. And so I'm kind of living in the moment with a series that is being read by kids in Mongolia and Iceland and China and Korea. And, that kind of just blows my mind. And so,
right, I get that.
Kind of right now, just doing the Dragon Masters thing. But yeah, I think all writers have, like I have whispers of ideas.
Yes, and it's easy to kind of have these ideas and almost feel like you're drowning in your own success, where you have this series that you're currently putting out, and you have these ideas that are just sitting there.
The Dragon Wagon takes a lot of time too, right? So it's like prioritizing.
And it's also interesting that you had a very non-traditional route to publishing, where you started off working as a book packager and doing outlines, whereas a lot of people, you see that they wrote stories and they had a manuscript out of high school that they pushed. As for like these people that may not be on a traditional path towards publishing, do you have any advice for these aspiring authors?
I think there are, that's the thing. Most professions, there's a clear career path, right? I go to college, I studied this, I look in a newspaper, I apply for a job. You cannot apply for, I want to get my book published necessarily. So I had to figure it out on my own. I don't think there's one right or wrong way to do it. I think the best thing you can do is to read all you can, study writing. As an author, I have a lot of people who ask me for advice on, I have a children's book idea, and the first thing I will recommend is take a course in writing children's books, because it might not be the process, what you think it is, and also do some research and go to a bookstore and look at what kids are reading and what publishers are publishing, and does your idea, it doesn't always have to fit, but it should be, you can see what's similar, and that'll help you know where to go with your idea at the very least. But I always recommend, there's some wonderful children's book writing courses online. Some are free. Workshops you can go in person. I would say do that work if you have an idea that you want to sell.
All right, and I got to say, this has been a lovely conversation. It has just flown by. I'm almost upset at how fast
Aww.
This has hit the mark. To close this off, this is the question I like to ask all authors that come on the podcast, so feel free to answer in any way that you see appropriate. How would you describe yourself and the work that you do as an author?
Okay. Oh, that's wow. Okay. I guess I would describe myself as an author who especially enjoys working with kids who are discovering reading and figuring out what about a book will make them want to keep reading, and to give that to those kids. I think it's more about me figuring out how to get kids excited about reading.
And that has been an interview with Tracey West. It is probably my top 3 favorite interviews I've done for the podcast so far. Her new book, The Epic Guide to Dragon Masters, is out now wherever books are found. It is a celebration of 10 years of the Dragon Masters series. Please remember that if you enjoy the podcast, you can share, like, favorite, etc. wherever podcasts are found. You can also check the links in the description of the podcast to find ways to support it. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.